To understand how a human being actually works, the first scientists of the mind decided they had to remove the human being from the actual world. In the late 19th century, the study of the mind transitioned from philosophy to experimental science. Researchers adopted the explicit, quantitative tools that had just propelled chemistry and physics to prominence. The pioneer of this approach was Wilhelm Wundt. He championed a highly controlled method, searching for general laws of human behavior by reducing subjects to measured reaction times and eliminating outside variables. But this rigid laboratory focus met immediate resistance. Critics like philosopher Wilhelm Dilthey argued that the laboratory was the wrong tool for the job. Dilthey pointed out that human experience is defined by infinite tangles of past experience and present circumstance. Stripping those away to measure a reflex in a sterile room didn't isolate human nature. It destroyed the very complexity that defines it. He proposed a descriptive psychology instead, one that observed the individual out in the world, capturing all of their unique idiosyncrasies. This debate trapped researchers in a binary for the next 100 years. They could either run neat, controlled experiments that ignored the real world, or they could write descriptive narratives of real life that defied scientific generalization. In academic institutions, Wundt's structured, constrained model won out. Psychology became a science of the laboratory. By the mid-20th century, this approach reached its zenith in highly publicized, highly controlled experiments, like Philip Zimbardo's mock prison studies or Stanley Milgram's tests on obedience to authority. These studies produced fascinating data on how people react in extreme artificial situations, but they struggled to explain how those same people functioned outside the testing room. The discipline had become incredibly effective at explaining strange behaviors in strange places. What it lacked was the ability to explain the mundane environments where everyday human development actually happens. In the late 1970s, a developmental psychologist named Yuri Bronfenbrenner proposed a solution. He published a text arguing that psychology didn't have to choose between scientific rigor and real-world relevance. It could be both. His central thesis was that human behavior isn't generated solely by the internal machinery of the individual. The answers lie in the evolving interactions between a person and their surrounding environment. To build this new framework, Bronfenbrenner looked back to his childhood. He grew up on the grounds of a large state institution in New York, where his father worked as a neuropathologist in the 1920s. The institution housed individuals designated by the state as feeble-minded. Many of the children there lived in highly restricted cottage wards with up to 80 inmates supervised by just 2 matrons, but frequently local courts would commit perfectly normal children to the facility, simply out of administrative error or sheer desperation. After a few weeks of confinement in the barren ward, these normal children were required to take a standardized intelligence test. By the time they took the test, their Stanford Binet scores had plummeted. The lack of stimulation in the ward degraded their cognitive performance. They were legally classified as mentally deficient, trapping them in the institution permanently. However, an alternative pathway existed for adult female inmates, who were often reassigned to work inside the private homes of the medical staff. Inside these homes, they were immersed in a dynamic setting. They helped with cooking, managed household chores, cared for children, and exercised daily initiative. Retested after living in this enriched domestic environment, these same women easily passed the critical minimum score on their intelligence tests. The cognitive capacity of these individuals hadn't changed, their context had. Bronfenbrenner defined development as a lasting change in the way a person perceives and deals with their environment. But studying the environment poses a massive mathematical problem. How do you measure the outside world without drowning in infinite random variables? Bronfenbrenner solved this by proposing a rigid architectural model. He conceived of the ecological environment as a topological set of nested structures, each inside the next, like a set of Russian dolls. At the absolute center of this architecture is the core unit, the developing person. The first layer surrounding the individual is the microsystem. This is the immediate physical setting containing the developing person. It includes the home, the school classroom, or the traditional psychology laboratory. For decades, traditional psychology placed a hard boundary right here, treating everything outside of it as irrelevant noise. To move beyond the lab, Bronfenbrenner defined a second layer, the mesosystem. This requires mapping the structural interconnections between these single locations. A child's ability to learn to read in primary school isn't dictated solely by the teacher in the classroom. It is heavily dependent on the invisible, structural inequities existing between that school and the child's home. The framework then pushes even farther afield, capturing forces that standard observation completely misses. This third layer is the exosystem. It introduces a radical hypothesis. An individual's development is profoundly altered by events occurring in settings where that person is never physically present. Consider a child's relationship to a parent's workplace. A sudden shift in corporate policy, mandatory overtime, or a change in management does not directly touch the child. Yet that external pressure alters the parent's behavior, which in turn degrades the immediate environment inside the home. A traditional laboratory experiment observing that child would record the resulting behavioral shift as a random variable or simply statistical error. Bronfenbrenner's model reveals that those distant, invisible structures must be mapped because they dictate the exact operational capacity of the immediate settings we live in. The final overarching boundary of this architecture is the macro system. The macro system consists of the broad cultural, economic, and political blueprints of a society. It is the overarching framework that determines the shape, constraints, and resources of every system nested beneath it. Bronfenbrenner tested these nested structures through decades of cross-cultural field research, analyzing environments in Nova Scotia, the USSR, Israel, and China. By observing development across entirely different macrosystems, he documented that different overarching environments systematically produce discernible differences in talent, temperament, and human relations. This empirical reality challenges the assumption that human nature is a singular, fixed biological absolute. Human nature is plural. The biological capacity of our species is highly versatile, but the actual potential we express is entirely dependent on the specific ecological container we are grown inside. This nested model forces a hard, actionable conclusion. If we want to change human behavior, we have to change human environments. And the most effective mechanism for engineering that change is public policy. Public policy operates at the macro system level. When you pull a policy lever, it alters the geometry of the entire outer boundary. Legislation that dictates educational funding, healthcare access, or workplace labor conditions cascades downward. It reshapes the exosystem of the parent, which restructures the mesosystem of the community, ultimately altering the immediate stimuli that shape the biology of the developing child. For a century, the study of the human mind was fractured between researchers demanding laboratory rigor and those demanding real-world relevance. The ecology of human development resolves the crisis. It proves that psychology cannot be a unified science if it only studies isolated subjects. Instead, the field advances by mapping and intentionally engineering the social architecture that surrounds us.